Today's story is based on true events. This is about a group of men who called themselves the Family. They had power and influence throughout southern parts of Australia. Their only club bylaw was to literally kidnap and take pleasure in turning men and boys into disposable sex objects. Some of these stories are really sick, so be warned. Let's begin. 1979 in the city of Adelaide, which is an affluent, trendy coastal metropolitan city on the southern coast. A man named Isaac, who worked in the city, happened to be an accountant for a large firm. More specifically, Isaac was in charge of a large, multi-million-dollar project with a short deadline to get it done. Just 3 weeks into the start of this project, the workload was beginning to stress him out. When he got home, Isaac fixed himself a drink and downed it in one shot. Thinking about everything that he had to do the following day was keeping his mind too distracted, so he needed to wind down somehow. He came up with a great idea and chose to take a walk to help disconnect before it became completely dark outside. A short distance away from his home was a reservoir named South Para. This reservoir provides drinking water to the surrounding area and for the city of Adelaide. It also provided fishing and kayaking as entertainment. When he arrived, it was near dusk. He crossed an old bridge and then walked on an old dirt path that runs parallel with the water's edge. While walking, he noticed a long-type object floating on the surface of the water. It seemed a little strange because the reservoir is normally protected from dumping with security patrols and huge penalty signs posted throughout the area, typically deterring any type of this activity. Thinking it was just trash, this actually annoyed Isaac, so he thought to himself, how can people be so disgusting? It's our drinking water. He kept walking, but the closer he got, the more the object began to look weird. There were too many obstructions, such as a sitting bench and a tree, to get a clearer view. When he came close enough, it appeared as if someone had dumped a fully clothed mannequin, which happened to be face down, into the water. It wasn't until he noticed that this mannequin had shoulder-length hair as when he realized this was a deceased male. The man quickly ran off to notify the authorities, and they responded. The body was extracted and an autopsy was completed. What happened to this poor young man was nothing short of pure savagery, so if you have weak stomachs, you might want to pass this part. The victim happened to have obvious signs of being tortured. He had deep knife cuts across his chest and back. The lacerations were consistent with someone being restrained or being held down during the actual cutting and removal of flesh. Weird shapes that served absolutely no purpose but to inflict torture were made by the actor when his poor flesh was removed from his body. Be warned, this story gets much worse. The victim was severely beaten with a heavy object causing massive bruises and several of his bones to break. To prolong the torture, the victim was drugged by the captor. Shockingly, the victim didn't die due to these injuries. He was unalive due to the actor taking a blunt object and impaling it into his bowel movement cavity that created massive blood loss. Allegedly, the coroner at the time acknowledged that they had never encountered a human being that was unalived in such a manner. Unfortunately, this is not the worst gruesome fate that this coroner would see in the near future. Moving forward, a 16-year-old teenager by the name of Bobby was allegedly rambunctious and wasn't interested in listening to his parents at all. Bobby would never accept no for an answer, and that included from his parents. He would regularly sneak out of his house and be caught by his family. Allegedly, Bobby had plenty of friends that would normally go with him, but over time, they were all caught and eventually grounded by their own parents. Bobby wasn't going to let that stop him. So this particular evening, like usual, he waited for his parents to go to bed, grabbed his backpack, and climbed out of his window. When he got to the main road, he stuck his thumb out to hitchhike with any vehicle headed in the direction towards the city. Several days had passed after Bobby's parents had submitted a missing persons report to the police. He would have usually returned by now, so they became concerned and contacted the department. One of the investigators overheard someone talking about a recent discovery that piqued his interest, so he reached out to a colleague for more information. That discovery was the body of a young man found floating in the reservoir. Police determined that the body in the morgue was actually Bobby. It was Bobby who endured all of this inhumane torture. 2 months later, a 25-year-old man by the name of Rick had been reported missing by his loved ones, was found unalive. Rick's body looked as though he was an unwilling participant in a science project. The police believed that the same actor or actors were involved. The victim was dissected. Rick's body was found in separate trash bags floating in the local river. One bag contained his tattoos that were individually and surgically cut off his body, likely in an attempt to avoid identifying his remains. The second bag contained his disemboweled torso and dismembered head. The culprit must have thought it would be humorous to take a rope and connect the head to the torso. This was done by running a rope through the victim's mouth and out the bottom of the neck. Then took the end of the rope through the victim's torso and then tied both ends together at the victim's mouth in a knot. The final bag contained the rest of the victim's remains. The coroner determined that the victim was unalive due to blood loss from a blunt object being forced into his bowel movement cavity. 3 days prior to the discovery of Rick's body, the authorities received an anonymous emergency phone call stating that evening that a man on foot was being chased by a van driven by 2 men. The man really looked distressed, and the incident did not seem to look like any prank was going on. The man was last seen running into the wooded area to avoid being run over by this vehicle. The police responded to the area, but nothing was found amiss. The description given matched Rick's age, race, and clothing. Police believe that this was Rick fleeing for his life before he was ultimately captured by his victimizers. Authorities knew that they had to do everything possible to stop these criminals because the news had heard about the slayings, and this had created a media circus backlash. Unfortunately, it would take an additional 3 victims that were deleted in similar fashion before the authorities found any leads. Sidebar: I attempted to locate additional information, but I was unable to locate anything further. I can assume but can't confirm because the case is still pending, so a lot of methods that were used to apprehend some of the actors were not divulged. Now back to the story. Somehow the authorities were able to link the bodies of the first victim, Bobby, and the last victim by the name of Keith, who was 14 years old at the time, to a man by the name of Vaughn. Vaughn was an executive businessman that when the police interviewed him, they discovered that he was part of a crew of 12 individuals that were financially well off and or politically connected that shared dark common interests. A few of those interests were using drugs and having rough relations with boys and young men. At every turn during the police investigations, people were interfering from different affluent positions within society. Those unnamed individuals were supplying resources and personnel to assist all parties accused of these crimes. I believe the authorities would not provide their names due to a lack of evidence and to avoid civil lawsuits. These persons of interest and their backgrounds spanned from doctors, businessmen, on down to male street workers. The authorities collected enough evidence to arrest Vaughn and 2 others for being present when 2 of the victims were being tortured and unalived by Vaughn. Due to the mishandling of evidence, charges for these 2 actors were dropped by the police. During further investigation, the authorities believed that this underground organization was responsible for at least 100 kidnappings and assaults of young boys and men over a 10-year span. Between the years of 1973 and 1983, many of the victims were kidnapped, drugged, violated, and then released if they survived the torture and abuse. They all turned out to be young boys and men. The police believe that many of the victims had never been located or are unaccounted for because their corpses were disposed of. It is not known if the family crime organization had been dismantled or is still active since. Vaughn was charged, found guilty, and given a life sentence for 2 homicides.